Hello and welcome to another episode of Quickies with Angela and Caity.
I'm Angela Dawn of Authentic Heart Coaching. I'm a tantric sex coach and I help couples get closer.
And I'm Caity Wilkinson of Caity Coaches. I'm a sex, love, and relationship coach, and I can help you bring more pleasure to your partnership by bringing more pleasure to yourself. Our guest for this episode is Stacy Stoddard, a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist who specializes in trauma, grief, and loss, and who has extensive expertise in the specific modality called EMDR.
Right, Caity, I wanted to have Stacy come on Quickies to talk about EMDR as a way to heal sexual trauma. Often, when clients come to me for coaching around sex, love, and relationships, they're dealing with some kind of trauma from their past. And if someone has a significant trauma history, I always want them to either have already worked extensively with a trauma specialist or at least be getting help for that piece concurrently along with coaching.
Right, because although you and I, Angela, are trauma informed as coaches, we're not trauma specialists. So we are very excited to have you here today, Stacy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So first, Stacy, can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners like a little bit about your background so they know who we're talking to?
Yeah, sure. So, like you guys said, I'm a licensed therapist in Maryland, and I specialize. I have a group practice that I own, and we all work out of in Towson, Maryland. We all do EMDR, in addition to other things, but I have been trained in EMDR for about 20 years and have been practicing it since then. And I even train other therapists in EMDR. It has become a huge part of my practice because I think it is one of the best ways to heal trauma, like what you guys are talking about. And it is just a fabulous thing that I really, really love. So that's what I do.
Awesome. It's funny because I met Stacy personally before I really knew her professionally. And then I kind of like heard it through the professional grapevine that she taught people EMDR. And I was like, whoa, really impressed.
Oh, I actually do that probably almost more than my clinical work now. I mean, I keep clients. I will always keep clients. I love the client work, but educating people in all of this and in trauma-informed care, like what you guys are talking about, whether you're a therapist or not, is super important. So
I'd love to define the word trauma for our listeners, as we hear it getting thrown around quite a lot these days, and there might be some confusion as to what qualifies as trauma, especially if we get into the more nitty-gritty of like what's the capital T big stuff trauma versus like the lowercase t kind of everyday trauma. So how would you describe or define trauma, Stacy?
Oh, Caity, it's a great question. Thanks for asking because I do think you're right. It gets thrown around a lot now. I can tell you how many TikToks I've seen where people just throw out, I've had trauma, and by that they mean my dinner last night didn't turn out well, right? Like that's not what we're talking about. But I also want to be cautious to not just define trauma by like the clinical definition of like PTSD, right? Because there are many people who have traumatic experiences that don't technically meet all the criteria for PTSD, but that doesn't mean it's not trauma. So kind of the definition I often go with, Caity, is a little bit of like a does it feel really yucky to you when you think back on it?
Mm.
And if it does, I'm going to call that a trauma for you. And I don't care if it's big T, little t, I don't even get caught up in that. It's when you think back, does it feel yucky? And many of us, for our early sexual experiences, we have many that we look back and go, oh, I didn't really know what was happening at the time, but it does feel yucky. And so we work with that as a trauma in therapy. Again, whether it's a clinical diagnosis of it or not.
Mm. I like that.
Yeah.
Yucky. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't like that, but that's
Right?
great. It's kind of a very simple way to explain, what a trauma is. I think nearly everyone has had some kind of experience they can look back on that in
For
that.
sure.
Mhm.
For
And I love
sure.
how it's
And
language. Oh, sorry.
oh, just one more piece real quick is that I also, I mean, we could go into, but it's not as like that, like just does this resonate with me as a yucky experience? But there are some biological components of how we can also tell that someone, it's kind of a quote trauma as opposed to just
Mhm.
oh, this is a thing that happened. And it's often the like what kind of sends our bodies into
Mhm.
some sort of fight, flight, freeze, or now we add fawning to that as a new category, kind of biological response. So if somebody says, if I think back on an early experience, and my body feels a little frozen and I can't really breathe as clearly as I could. Or if I start to kind of go, oh my God, I got to get out of this conversation. I don't that like any of those can also be indicators. And, and at another time, if you want, we could even talk about how trauma lives in the brain and what has
Mhm.
actually happened neurologically that keeps that trauma from being able to just be like any other memory. But again, that's a little more, but like the gut feeling is kind of that, ugh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we would love to have you again to talk a little bit more about trauma because I'm telling you, this is something that so many of us are dealing with, and especially, like you said, around kind of initial sexual experiences
Mhm.
or childhood, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know the statistic. You guys might know better than me, but like it's almost like 90% of people have had some sort of unpleasant, unwanted, yucky sexual something. It's remarkably and unfortunately high.
absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I also want you to explain what EMDR is for our listeners because
Yes.
I know a lot of people have never heard of it.
Yeah. So it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what EMDR really understands and what the modality is meant to do is understanding that talk alone does not heal trauma. Talking is helpful, talking is remarkably an important part of the process. But because trauma lives, just like I just mentioned, it lives in the body, it lives in the brain, that just talking about it isn't enough. And so EMDR uses eye movements. And when we move our eyes back and forth rapidly, for viewers who are watching, you see like when we move our eyes back and forth rapidly, that is the same thing that we do when we go into REM sleep, is that rapid eye movement sleep. And when we go into that state of sleep, it's our body's natural way of kind of reprocessing what happened during the day. And I always say you go into REM sleep and your brain takes everything it's done during the day and kind of puts it in the right filing folders, right? Like if I had a dinner that tasted really good, it would go in the really good dinner category, right? Folder. But when something yucky has happened, our brains don't file that away when we go into REM sleep. And our brains don't do that because it's our way of trying to keep ourselves safe,
Mm.
right? So, like, if I file away this experience that was, unwanted, let's say, then there's a part of me that's going to go, well, I can't forget that because then I'm going to be vulnerable for it happening again. So I don't want to file that away. I want to remember, but we don't really want to remember. And so it just hangs out in the filing cabinet room of our brains, right? It just like hangs out in there, unable to kind of be really put in the past, which is where we want traumas to go, is in the past and not
Mhm.
keep staying in the present. So so what EMDR does is uses our body's natural way of reprocessing things, but with more of a, research-based protocol and some scripted protocols to go in and take those things that have not been able to be filed naturally and do that in a therapeutic setting. So eye movements is definitely a part of that, and like I said, it's there's more to it. Like it's not like something you show up and just have one session of and it's all done. It's in terms of healing from trauma, it is one of the quickest ways. On average, somebody might even only take 6 sessions to work through and completely reprocess through their whole
Mhm.
body, something that they've been living with for years and years and years. And like I said, it's been around since the 80s. It is heavily, heavily research based, which I think is also really important.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And it works so quickly too.
Really amazing. Yeah. Hmm.
How often does it tend to be successful? Like, are there some instances where a person's going to have many, many, many sessions and it just never works for them? Or is it something that tends to stick right away?
So I am again, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen it like, I think it works for everybody, but maybe not that quick, I will say. Some
Mhm.
people who have, I mean, we've seen people that have had ongoing childhood sexual abuse for years and years and years, and that's not going to stop in 6 sessions because it gets really kind of the threads get really twisted up in kind of how we experience triggers in the world, and we don't even know that it's a trigger from that. And so it can be really complicated and long based on it, but I sure wouldn't say it doesn't work for people. um and there have been times I have seen it not work for people, but I typically think that it's because the client wasn't kind of prepared enough. They
Mhm.
couldn't kind of tolerate the work. And so the whole EMDR protocol spends a lot of time getting the person ready for the reprocessing. And I have seen some EMDR therapists that jump in a little too early and then it doesn't work. Or if the client's really dissociative, it's not going to work. But again, I don't think that that's usually, Caity, because EMDR isn't going to work for that person. I just think some of the preparation stuff hasn't been done, that maybe they're not stable enough for it yet, something like that. But again, I think done right, I think it works.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does it vary
Yeah.
based on the severity of the trauma? Like, I know that the trauma is going to be relative to the person who experienced it, but does the severity impact what the EMDR process looks like?
A little bit, and definitely with length or how much preparation somebody needs, the more severe. But I'll also say everyone is so different. I mean, you guys see this all the time, right? And so
Yeah.
I've seen, if I had two people come to me with, let's say, the exact same trauma, which doesn't ever really happen, but like some people's kind of resilience skills are just higher, their ability to cope with it and have had more support through their lives to manage it, versus someone else who maybe has never had a day of therapy in their life, and they tucked it so far back, they never ever got any support around it. That definitely impacts the length and what I would call kind of how kind of complicated unsmooth it would look. Let me say that. Some can be smoother than others.
Got it.
Yeah, I hear that, Stacy. I mean, I know, as a coach, I work with a lot of people, individuals and couples, and I can do the same exercise with 20 people, and the 21st person, man, it was too much for them, and it is such a dance to figure out exactly how to meet your client where they are.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Well,
I'm
I think
sure.
you're right on, Angela, because that dance also happens in EMDR. Again,
Yeah.
there's structure to it, but the dance absolutely happens.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, so since we mostly talk about sex here, Stacy, can you speak more specifically about how EMDR can be particularly helpful in healing sexual trauma?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, because sexual trauma is body based and it impacts so many parts of our lives, relationships, how we feel about ourselves, our own relationship to our body, our relationships to other people's bodies. Like we can't escape being in our body, right? And so I think I think that's a lot why the sexual traumas kind of what I call like kind of get into our bones a little bit. Like it's one thing if like somebody, let's say somebody says something hurtful to you and it really, really hurts. That for some people that gets in there and kind of lives like a trauma, but it's different than a sexual one because um it doesn't involve our bodies, and it also often involves a lot of kind of control pieces, right? It's really
Mm.
important for us to feel like we have control over our own bodies, um, to stay safe, right? Not because we're control freaks, but that's how we feel safe in the world. And so, I think it really challenges people in that way. Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. I just think I've heard so many good stories from people who've had successes with EMDR. And, if somebody comes to me and they really have something serious to deal with that's like beyond the scope of my coaching, I'm always like, find someone that does EMDR and let me know if you need recommendations, because I think it is a really profoundly helpful modality. Now, one thing I had heard about, and I don't really know if this is for real or not, but I did hear some folks talking about using EMDR for low sexual desire, or ED, premature ejaculation, that sort of thing. And I was pretty sus. And I was curious to hear what you had to say about that.
So I think probably we could use EMDR for that, because one of the things that EMDR does is it looks at the historical events in somebody's life that is impacting where they are today, right? Like
Mhm,
maybe
mhm,
I'm having trouble being really open in my sexual relationship with my partner because I had some early experiences where being open wasn't safe to do or didn't result
mhm,
in a feeling of safety. But EMDR also works with our present stuff. And so
mhm,
if our present stuff is something like ED, say, we can absolutely use EMDR to work with that. And then I'm even going to add another piece, which EMDR can work with future worries. So we
mhm.
could look ahead to the next time I'm about to have sex and I am worried about ED showing up again, and EMDR can do some work around future worries like that. So it's actually an EMDR. It's called the three-pronged protocol, where we work with past, present, and future. And so all of those can happen. But then the other thing I will say about that is that almost all of the time, what is showing up in the present is connected to something historical. It's
Yeah.
very rare that it's not, right? And even if it is just something biological like ED, right? Like, let's say it doesn't seem like it's connected to anything history, but we start to make meaning of that,
Mhm.
usually in a way that is not adaptive, what we call,
Yeah.
right? So somebody starts to go, what's wrong with me? I'm not as good as somebody else. I'm whatever. And that is often related to something historical as well, that self-identifying belief. And EMDR works with those self-identifying beliefs all the time. Often, here you're going to like this, Angela, often if clients cannot connect the historical piece, if
Mhm.
somebody were to come to me with, I just keep using ED as an example here, but if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm having this problem, I'm going to dig around a little bit about some historical stuff, but I'm also going to say, well, what are you telling yourself that means about you, that
Mhm.
you have this thing? And they're going to say something like, it means I'm not good enough. And then I'm going to
Mm.
go, when else have you felt not good enough in your life? And
Yeah.
we're going to start to trace that. So those self-identifying beliefs, I bet you guys can imagine, if we could work on that with EMDR, it changes everything about their relationship with their present stuff. It makes it much easier to work with.
That's
Yeah.
frequently an element within coaching as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I was going to say. There's so much in what you just said, Stacy, that I just want to
Mhm.
like go after. Caity
Yeah.
and I did an episode on ED. Was
Uh-huh.
it our first or second season, Stacy? Do you remember? I don't remember if it was season 1 or 2, but we have an episode on ED. And I actually just recently sent it to someone, because people are always looking for the drug or the ointment or the quick fix for that. And the reality is, it's probably something historical or
Uh-huh.
some kind of self identification that is deeply stored in their body that they're not even necessarily aware that they carry with them into their next experience. And if I can get at that as a coach, 9 times out of 10, we've solved the problem.
I
Yeah.
don't doubt that at all, right? And it can even kind of be like, it makes me think of like panic attacks, right? Somebody has a panic attack and then they start to panic about having a panic attack
Yes.
again. And
Mhm.
it's just like snowballs. Yeah.
The
Mhm.
emotion about the emotion,
Oh, right. Right.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. if we can get at those, underlying beliefs, it can do so much.
That's
So much.
huge, really, truly.
Yeah.
So, Stacy, if a member of our audience has been through something traumatic, if they have that yuck and they haven't sought help with it yet, or maybe they didn't really recognize it as trauma before, but now they're kind of curious, what advice would you have for someone in that situation?
Mhm. I mean, I really do think that kind of the best healing modalities for trauma, whether they want EMDR or, some other things that are out there, is to get some help. I don't think we can sit at home and heal our traumas in our bedrooms by ourselves. I think it is a very relational dynamic that needs to play in as well. So whatever kind of help that looks like, I know there's some group support stuff, like there are all sorts of options. I'm of course here because I think EMDR is one of the best options, but there are others, but definitely getting some professional support.
Are
Mhm.
there any specific resources that you'd like to recommend to people?
Well, if somebody's specifically looking for EMDR support, and I know I've given you guys my website for our team of people that work with this, but if it's much more nationally, there is a website called EMDRIA. It's EMDR International Association, so emdria.org. And they have a Find an EMDR Therapist button on their page that lists EMDR therapists all over the world. It is an international organization. So that's a great way to find an EMDR therapist in your area.
Great. I can go ahead and link that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect, Caity. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is a fascinating subject, and we could go on and on about it, but I'm just really glad to have you on here, Stacy, and expose people to it, because I think a lot of people think about therapy and they think about it just being talking to someone. And trust me, there is a ton of value in talking to someone. There's a ton of value in a variety of different therapeutic approaches, but when you've got the big yuck, you have to bring out, the big guns with it. And
Yeah.
I feel like EMDR is like this tool that most people just haven't heard of, haven't been exposed to. And I'm, all about helping people heal their trauma. So thank you for coming on the episode today.
Yeah, you bet. I hope too, I might be jumping ahead for you guys, but if I were to say like, if anybody's going to have like a takeaway from this, I hope a takeaway that a lot of people can have about their traumas is that there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing, you didn't do anything wrong. Like, again, this is just how our bodies process yucky things in an attempt to keep us safe. So I think if people can feel kind of normalized by that, like, oh yeah, my brain just did this thing because that was kind of yucky. Oh, well, like if you break your arm, you're going to go get a cat, like whatever, you're just going to deal with it. And I think if we can kind of destigmatize the therapy, help people know you're not just going to sit in a room and talk about stuff, again, remarkably helpful, but that's not all we're going to do. We're going to get in
Mhm,
there and make
mhm.
this better. And there's nothing wrong with you that you need help in making it better.
Yeah,
Amen.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work that Caity and I were trained in, a lot of the work that I do is very much somatic, right? There's
Yes.
that book that everybody references now, The Body Keeps the Score, but that's gold. I mean, it really is true.
Yeah.
And sometimes just talking through the experiences, well, I don't know, maybe it'll just make you dissociate, right?
It
It's not
absolutely does for
necessarily
some
helpful,
people,
right?
right? Yeah. Yeah.
Or we don't want to talk about them. But the fact that trauma just really like lives in the body. And
Yeah.
if we can locate it in the body, through somatic work,
Yes.
the healing is possible, absolutely possible. And I think that that's just something that, again, people aren't familiar with, that we really store these traumas. And referencing what you said earlier, it's to keep us safe,
Right.
right? Our body minds are like, oh, what happened? We want to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Yes.
So it's there in the forefront of our mind when it should be in the past, or it's there in our body. And the interesting thing to me, another thread from when you were talking about future thinking, how
Mhm.
that can work with EMDR. I always tell people, you don't have to remember the source of the trauma to remove it.
Right.
You can find it in the body. You don't have to know why it's there, right? So it can be this mystery trauma that makes you act a certain way, but we can still work with it somatically. You can still work with it in EMDR, so there's a lot of options for feelings we're carrying with us that we don't even know why we're carrying.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've done a lot. Excuse me, done a lot of EMDR with people who can't pinpoint the trauma,
Mhm.
or if they can pinpoint it, they don't want to talk about it, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
Alrighty, that about wraps up this episode. So thank you again so much for your time here today, Stacy, and for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. This is such a fascinating subject. And I know if our listeners would like to hear more about you and your work, we're going to put your website in the show notes.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
All right, and that's all for this episode of Quickies with Angela and Caity. Thank you all for listening, and you can follow us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
And if you'd like more great information on sex, love, and relationships, be sure to follow us on social media. I am at Authentic Heart Coaching on Instagram, and I'm AuthenticHeartCoach.com on the web.
And you can find me on CaityCoaches.com, as well as Instagram and Reddit at CaityCoaches.
For our male listeners, if you're curious about lasting longer in bed, we often talk in tantric sex about delaying male ejaculation. And yeah, that's a thing that most people want in general. So check out our Stamina 101 mini course for men. It's completely free and it'll guide you through a week of simple but powerful practices to transform your relationship with your erection and your orgasm.
And speaking of orgasm, we have a spectacular class bundle called Pussy Whispering, all about vulva pleasure and creating the most spectacular orgasms and sexual aliveness in this area of the body. This is both for people who already have amazing sex lives, as well as anybody who doesn't enjoy sex as much as they'd like to yet. So we have classes for both anyone with a vulva and for their partner. You can visit pwclass.com to learn more.
And I want to tell you about my new private coaching offer for couples. It's called Get Closer. You can apply to be coached via a button on the couples section of my website. And that's also where you'll find information about my tantric retreats. And the big news there, if you haven't heard yet, is that I'm going to do a couples tantra retreat in July 2024 in Costa Rica, in addition to my monthly programs coming up in March, April, and May. In the show notes, you'll find a link to watch a video explaining more details about the retreat. And if you're interested in learning more about the retreat, please do reach out and email me at angeladawn@AuthenticHeartCoach.com, and we can set up a time to talk about whether it's the right fit for you and your partner. As of this show recording, I have about 2 spots left, so definitely jump on and send me an email.
And with that said, we'll see you next time on Quickies with Angela and Caity.